The French imperialism started in 1954 and ended in 1962. Gradually, French control was established over much of northern, western, and central Africa by the turn of the century. French focused on developing agriculture, especially cotton, rice, and sugarcane, and exported from dominant by coffee, cotton, timber. The main method that French colonized Western Africa was by using violence. The main goal of colonizing Western Africa was that they wanted to turn Western African countries into a French state. This means changing their way of living, making the official language French, and they also changed the African culture. French-controlled territories that would block British expansion westward, and eventually French territories would surround the British colonies, pinning them against the coast.
One of the first French colonies was founded in 1608 in present-day Quebec. It was founded by Samuel de Champlain and was the first settler colony that France had, known as New France. In the 1600s, when France began to enter the slave trade, French interest in Africa grew. The French established trading posts near the west coast of Africa in 1624. At the same time that the French were establishing trading posts in West Africa, they were also shipping slaves and raw materials to new colonies in the West Indies. This was because they were establishing valuable plantations for sugar, tobacco, and other natural resources. The most valuable colony in the French West Indies was Saint Dominique, presently known as Haiti. This colony used slave labor on plantations to export and harvest raw sugar and tobacco to be sent back to France. During the period of 1740 to 1815, France saw a series of internal conflicts that left the country almost bankrupt. The first was the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. Next was the 7 Years' War, 1750 to 1763. Next was the American Revolution, 1765 to 1783. After that followed the French Revolutionary Wars, 1793 to 1802. Then was the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. This almost 100 years of war left France in a very crippling economic state. After the series of wars from 1740 to 1815, France began to regain many of its colonies. First, the French West Indies were restored to them by Britain. Next, France began to focus its attention on Asia and Africa. After the series of French conflicts, France acquired many new colonies in Asia and Africa. France acquired Cambodia, Senegal, Syria, Lebanon, Algeria. France also acquired many smaller colonies in Asia known as French Indochina. Togo and Cameroon were also acquired by France after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. As France began to populate many of its African and Indochinese colonies, they were met by revolts and other uprisings of the native people. The French colonial empire began to fall during the early 1900s and then fell during World War II. France had begun to lose many of its foreign powers to revolutions and revolts within those countries and empires. France also became threatened when countries like Japan and Germany began to occupy many of their foreign colonies. In 1624, the French founded a colony, Saint Dominique, on present-day Haiti. This colony was located in the Caribbean and produced coffee and sugar on plantations using enslaved people brought from Africa. Up to 800,000 enslaved people were brought to the island to work on these plantations. This colony was also one of the first successful slave rebellions that took place. The slave rebellion began in 1791, and the slaves successfully defeated French forces in 1804. These free slaves now helped to free slaves on the Spanish side of the island.
French imperialism started to instigate a colonial war to hang on to its northern African colony of Algeria between 1954 and 1962. Papon had collaborated with the Nazi occupation during World War II and sent Jews, communists, and other resistance fighters to their deaths. French colonialism in Vietnam lasted more than 6 decades. By the late 1880s, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were all controlled by France and collectively referred to as French Indochina. Indochina became one of France's most important colonial possessions. French colonialism was focused largely on production, profit, and labor. It had a profound impact on the lives of people in Vietnam. France's population currently is 67.06 million. Its GDP is 2.716 trillion US dollars. Its capital city is Paris. The head of state or president is Emmanuel Macron. The type of government is described as a unitary state, semi-presidential system, and a constitutional republic. A brief description of the economy is that it's highly developed and free market oriented. The current population of Vietnam is 96.46 million people. Its GDP is 261.9 billion US dollars. The capital city is Hanoi. The head of state is Nguyen Phu Trong. The type of government is described as a socialist state, unitary state, communist state, and a one-party state. A brief description of the economy is that it is a socially oriented market.